Well, hello, English teachers of Catalonia. How lovely to see you here. My name's Jamie Keddie, and I'm very honoured to have been invited to give this talk as a way to kick off the 2023 APAC English Language Teaching Convention, the theme of which is Move On Up, Raising Standards in ELT. And it's very possible that we've met before. I've been involved in a few conventions in the past. In fact, I was just thinking beforehand, what was the last one? And I opened my photographs on my iPhone. I was very clever. I used the map, and took advantage of the geotagging feature, zoomed in on the University of Pompeu Fabra to find a few images, and look, 2019, this is exactly 4 years ago. This is somewhere upstairs in the university building. I still remember this session. This is a session on video and story. This is you. I remember it as being a really good session, specifically because I had such a great, appreciative, enthusiastic, interactive audience. And so what I'm doing as I make this video, I'm speaking to my camera in front of me. It's an inanimate object, but I'm thinking about you. I'm imagining you back there 4 years ago. It makes my job a lot easier to do that. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself and who I am before I tell you about where I'm going to take you. My name's Jamie Keddie. I am a Scottish person. Don't know how you feel about that. I hope you can understand this accent. It's not the strongest accent, is it? But I suppose that's because I've been teaching and teacher training for about 20 years. But if I was speaking with my sister, for example, and we'd have maybe 2 or 3 beers, the Scottish accent might come back. So I live in Barcelona. That there is Parallel, one of the busiest streets in Barcelona. I wonder if you agree with that. But because of the noise, because of the traffic, I'm making this video at night time when there are usually less cars and sirens, but usually more drunk people. So let's see how it goes. What else can I tell you? My sister lives in Barcelona too. I remember telling you that last time I was at an APAC convention. I was here first. I'm the big brother. She's a little sister. She copied me. She married a man called Pablo, who's a Madrileño, and they've got 2 nephews. So I've got a nice family here in Barcelona. And yes, I've been a teacher since 2001. I've been a teacher trainer since about 2007. Every summer I go to a city 2 hours north of London that you might know. It's called Norwich. Beautiful place, and I give my courses there at Norwich Institute for Language Education that some of you might know. My course is titled Image, Video and Story. I'm also an author. At this stage I might show you a slide with some of my books, but the great thing about this format is it allows for show and tell, doesn't it? So look, my 3 books that I have so far. Number 1, 2008, Images. Number 2, 2014, Bringing Online Video into the Classroom. And number 3, 2017, Video Telling. You see, my interests have been visual materials, image and video, and that connects to narratives and story and storytelling, and now teacher talk, which is what this talk is all about. This is Developing Teacher Talk. That's the title I've gone for. And you might be wondering, why is there a picture of Frankenstein's monster up there? You'll find out. The talk's going to be in 3 parts. Part 1 is an exploration of what we mean by teacher talk, and also what we think of when we think about teacher talk, because I feel that teacher talk as a term often gets a bad press. It suffers from a bad image, and I wonder if you agree with that. Part 2 is a case study of how the teacher's voice can be used. I'm going to tell you a story. The story is titled A Pulled Muscle and a Missed Opportunity. In fact, that was almost the title of this talk, but then I thought, well, what does that mean? So I went with Developing Teacher Talk. And part 3 is maybe a kind of a conclusion. I'm going to offer some suggestions, some practical ideas, and we're going to close it off there. All right, so let's get started with part one. Now, picture the scene. It's 2001, February 2001, in fact. Wow, 22 years ago. This is depressing. And I'm teaching English for the third time in my life. I'm in a classroom which is in a school on Diagonal. This is part of a Cert TESOL course that I'm doing. The first teaching practice session I did went really badly, as you can probably imagine. The second one, probably even worse. But this third time, there was some moments of, when things worked. I remember I was doing a reading activity. I'd chosen a text that I thought my students would like. I wonder if you can guess what the topic was. It was a very topical subject for 2001. It was a text on mad cow disease. I wonder if you remember that. Some of you weren't even born, I'm going to guess, in 2001. But the students, they read the text, they skimmed it, they scanned it, there was some language they took from it. The idea was then that we would now discuss it, and there would be a great, fantastic class discussion of the issues and the points contained within the text. And I was going to conduct it like an orchestra conductor. Of course, it didn't work like that. It was rubbish. And I remember that maybe 2 or 3 minutes before the end of the session, which was only about 20 minutes long, I ran out of things to do. The discussion died down. My students were sitting there looking at me. What do we do next, Jamie? There was 2 or 3 minutes to go. Oh my goodness me, what am I going to do? So I told them a joke. It was actually a topical joke. I don't know if you'll like this joke. It's not very funny. I'll tell it anyway. The joke is there's 2 cows standing in a field. The first cow says to the second cow, "What do you think of this mad cow disease then?" And the second cow says, "Why are you asking me? I'm a chicken." Not the funniest joke. I don't even know if my students understood it. I don't think they laughed. But that was it. I sat down probably just on the 20-minute dot, and a few of my classroom mates said, "Not bad class that, Jamie." No, we're very supportive, weren't we? And later, it was time for feedback. And I wonder what you think, what sort of feedback you think I got from my tutor. Now, fortunately, I've still got the folder which contains all the feedback notes that I got, and I can show you the exact written feedback that I received. I'm going to read it to you. Just before I do so, I should mention that my tutor 22 years ago, she is no longer in language education. I'm actually still in contact with her through a friend. She's given me permission to use this, so there is no ethical issue. I have permission to do this, although I'm not going to tell you her name because she did say don't tell anybody my name. Let me show you the feedback she gave me. This is what she wrote. She said, "Well done, Jamie. This was a well-planned lesson. Your subject matter encouraged lots of STT, which stands for student talking time. Your discussion was excellent." I was very happy to see that adjective. TTT, which is teacher talking time, was low. The students really enjoyed themselves and most of them contributed. However, that word is implied, aim not to turn the class into a Jamie show. Although it is funny, I think she's referring to the joke here. Remember that it's the students who need practice speaking, but on the whole, very good. So the message to me was quite clear, and we went into this in more detail, that the idea is that as a teacher, you've got to keep your talking time, your teacher talking time, down to a minimum. The reason is that students are the ones that are learning. You've got to give them opportunities to speak. Aim to raise the student talking time. And when my teacher told me this in the feedback, and then more formally to the whole class, it really made sense to me. It was a kind of aha moment. Oh, wow, yes, of course. It was almost an epiphany for me, because back at that time I'd started to learn Spanish. And, I was starting to realize that as well as all this input and these grammar rules that I was taking in, and all these words and collocations and phrases and functional phrases that I was learning, it was really, really important for me to exercise my brain and my mouth and produce the sounds of this new language to me, and retrieve those words and retrieve those phrases and construct those grammar structures and forms and put it all into practice. This is what I needed to do with my Spanish. So yes, absolutely, this is what my students need to do with their English. It made so much sense. And after my that course, that Cert TESOL course that I did, I went into the real world. I started teaching for myself, and I kind of remembered this mantra: always keep your teacher talking time down to a minimum. That's not to say I always did it, but it was always there at the back of my mind, you see. Now, about 3 years later, after I did that course, I went to one of my first ever conferences. It was in Paris, and I was lucky enough to see the late, great Dave Willis give a plenary. And it was a very informative, it was a very influential talk for me, although I don't remember specifically what the subject was or what the topic was. But he was, at one moment, he was talking about teacher talk and the teacher's voice. And he became quite animated. In fact, he became quite angry. And he claimed at one point that he said, "I don't know who the person was that decided that you should always keep your teacher talking time down to a minimum, but whoever it was that said that should be hanged." And I remember being quite confused by this, very surprised. What? How can you say such a thing? Surely you should always keep your teacher talking time down to a minimum, something that you have to do. So how can you claim otherwise? And I was quite confused, as I said. It took me a long time to maybe understand why Dave Willis felt this way. And I would say that talk, me seeing Dave Willis, was also quite influential on my own development as a teacher. So what I'm going to do now is tell you how teacher talk as a term has changed in my mind since then, how I've changed my attitude towards teacher talk and come to understand how it fits in to the discourse of our profession. And I think the good place to start is by recognizing that the teacher's voice, teacher talk, is actually, it's quite important for us to do our jobs. There's no way around it. Teacher talk is unavoidable. I mean, it's also completely expected from our students, and it's 100% necessary. It's essential. Think of all the different things that we do on a day-to-day basis that require our voices, which require teacher talk. There's conversing with students, making small talk with them, motivating them. We're talking here interpersonal communication. There's modeling the sounds of the language. There's giving feedback. In other words, we're talking about using our voices as pedagogical instruments. I don't know what you think of that term. We give instructions, we set up tasks and activities, we contextualize materials. If you're going to take a song or a text or a video or an authentic piece of material into the classroom, it's worthwhile just taking a moment to tell your students why you're using it, where you got it from, why you think they might like it. There's providing a source of language input. Very important. All of these situations require us to speak. Now, I wonder if you know what a rule of thumb is. A rule of thumb it's a guiding principle. It's something that might help you achieve something that you do in your work, your daily life. I guess it comes from the idea that, thumbs are about an inch long, and you can use your thumb to measure. I suppose that's where it comes from. In Spanish, I think Catalan, thumbs and inches come from the same word, don't they? Let me just show you. If you go onto Amazon, it's quite interesting because you can find a number of books which have rules of thumb in the title. Here we have Rules of Thumb, this book on the right, 1,000 Curious Solutions to Life's Problems. Rules of thumb, it's important that they come out of observation rather than theory. They are guiding principles. This book on the left, I think if you look down there, you can see there's an example. There's quite a few examples in the cover. One of them is to avoid a crash in a car race, aim your car at the spot where you see an accident start. The chances are that the accident will have moved by the time you get there. That's a pretty good rule of thumb, isn't it? As a guiding principle. On the right there, we're getting kind of specific here. Rules of thumb for specific purposes. These are for writers. You also got rules of thumb for a manual of quick, accurate solutions to everyday pipeline engineering problems. I wonder if any of you might find this useful if you work as pipeline engineers in your spare time. Rules of thumb for engineers and scientists. Here's another one. Pilots' rules of thumb. I wonder how you would feel if you walked onto a plane, you got a glimpse into the cockpit and you saw that the pilot was reading this book. I wonder how you'd feel. Now, I've never seen a book of rules of thumbs for teachers, but I think if there was one of the best rules of thumb that you could put in there, maybe on page 1, should be try and keep your teacher talking time down to a minimum and aim for your students to talk more. After all, it's usually students who need the practice. That, to me, is how that rule or that principle should be presented as a rule of thumb. Now, the problem is, it's never, or I don't want to use words never, because this is very much my own experience here. My own experience, it wasn't presented as a rule of thumb, as a guiding principle, as something to keep you right. It was presented as a mantra, as an absolute, as a black and white, as something that no matter what you must do. And the implication that came from this is quite simply that teacher talk is bad. It's a new film I'm producing. I hope it's going to be a Hollywood success. Hope you'll go and see it. We'll find out. But this is the idea, that teacher talk is stigmatized. And when you see it as being inherently bad, something you've got to avoid, something you've got to keep down to a minimum, to quash, to keep outside the classroom, we don't embrace it and do what we should do, which is to develop it. Which is the central idea of what I'm saying here. Rather than stigmatizing teacher talk, we have to develop it. We have to recognize the qualities, teacher talk skills, teacher talk techniques, and we have to work on them. That's the idea. That's the idea. Now, it's time to move on to a case study. This is a pulled muscle and a missed opportunity. So, how did it become daytime? A different shirt on. Wouldn't that be great if you could really do that in a live plenary talk? If you just disappear for a couple of days and come back with a clean shirt and a haircut. Another good thing about teaching and presenting online. So anyways, well, what we were just saying, this is just to recap for your sake as well as mine, or for my sake as well as yours. We were saying that teacher talk is essential, it's inevitable, it's expected, and rather than stigmatize it, it makes much more sense to me that we should develop it. And in this second part of the talk, a pulled muscle and a missed opportunity, I'd like to tell you a short story. And you might judge me for this. You might think I'm a bit nosy, because I wonder if any of you, I'm sure you do, you have private one-to-one students. And if so, do you ever do your classes in a public space? A cafe, for example, is something I've done a bit, and it's something I see quite often in a cafe downstairs, just a few blocks away from my flat on Parallel. Every now and again I see a teacher and their student just doing a one-to-one class, and because I'm a teacher I can't help but listen in. And don't judge me, you do the same, I know you would. And if you're doing it in a public space, it's fair game, isn't it? So anyway, what happened was, this is about 2 years ago. I was in that cafe, I was on my computer, on my laptop, doing a bit of work, and I noticed that in the corner there was a young man, a young Catalan man, and I'd seen him a few times before because I knew that he used to go there for English classes. But on that day, either his teacher was late or he'd arrived early, not sure, but eventually she turned up, and she walked into the cafe and she walked over to him, and as she did, I noticed and he noticed that she was limping. She was limping, as if she had injured herself. And when she walked over and sat down, he looked concerned, and he said, "What happened?" And she said, I pulled a muscle. And he didn't catch it. And he said, "You what?" And she said, I pulled a muscle, but it doesn't matter, I'm fine. Anyway, how was your weekend? What did you do? Did you get up to anything interesting? And his question wasn't answered, and they had a discussion about what he'd done at the weekend for 5 minutes before moving on to the main feature, which was, I don't know, a grammar activity or something like that. And my thoughts here are that in an attempt to be student-centered and go straight for the what did you do at the weekend and get the student talking, that teacher had missed out on a teaching opportunity. Now, it's not my intention to give that teacher a hard time. I'd seen her a few times before. She always struck me as being very professional, taking an interest in her student, very amicable. Her student always seemed to appreciate her for it. I also knew from my intuition, I could clearly see that she was a newly qualified teacher. She hadn't been teaching English for long at all. And because of that, there's something that I would say that she lacked, a very specific thing, something that I don't think we acknowledge or talk about enough. I'm talking about an essential ingredient here, something that teachers will build up over the years of their experience, and that thing is, in one word, awareness. Newly qualified teachers tend to lack that. In this case, as I mentioned, there was a lack of awareness that what the teacher had here was a teaching opportunity that she didn't capitalize on. The fact that there was a real life situation, something had happened to cause her to pull a muscle, her student had expressed an interest, asked a question, but she'd glossed over. I suppose it's possible that she didn't want to talk about it. We don't know what happened, but then she could have invented something. That's what I would have done. So what I'd like to do here is just, focus on this one single interaction and explore some of the things that she should have done using that pedagogical instrument, the teacher's voice, and look at some skills and qualities and techniques that we can exploit or employ to take advantage of a situation like that. I've got 8 for you, okay? Let's start with number 1. Language modelling. Quite simply, this is when the teacher produces a piece of language, speaking, so that learners can hear it clearly, so that they can then go on to produce it for themselves. And I think sometimes teachers, we feel that we've always got to be challenging our students to listen, but this is not about that. This is a situation where we have to be as kind as possible to our students. We have to let them hear the sound of the language. In this case, I pulled a muscle. I pulled a muscle. We have to think about enunciation, how clearly we're producing it. Sometimes it can benefit students if we kind of exaggerate our mouth movements and actually speak with an open mouth. It can feel quite strange, but I know that students can sometimes really appreciate this. I pulled a muscle. I'm not saying I do this very often, but I know it's a technique we can fall back on sometimes. Pace, your speed. I mean, we talk about teacher talk time too much, but in my mind, that's not always the worst thing that teachers can do. What about teacher talk speed? When teachers lack an awareness, sometimes they talk too fast. We've seen it, we've done it. So reduce your speed, reduce your pace. Not to a complete crawl, but find a natural pace for the language. I pulled a muscle. Slow down a bit. I pulled a muscle. Rhythm, draw attention to the rhythm. I pulled a muscle. I pulled a muscle. These are the techniques, these are the qualities that we need to model the language. This is maybe the most essential teacher talk skill of all. Space is pretty important. I've seen couples break up because one of them said to the other, the relationship wasn't working. You weren't giving me enough space. And similarly, if we want to be kind to our students in a situation like this, when we've just modeled a phrase, I pulled a muscle. We have to give them an opportunity to hear it, to let those sounds reverberate in the mind's ear. I pulled a muscle. Give students an opportunity to make meaning from it. I pulled a muscle. What does that mean? Well, that word muscle is very similar to a Catalan word, so maybe, okay, I think I might understand that. This is the meaning emergence, which will only happen if you give your students an opportunity to do so. Silence should not be regarded as being uncomfortable or awkward. It's essential. It's something maybe we can think about a lot when we're teaching. I know that I've filmed myself teaching and watched the recording and thought, oh no, that's terrible. You're interrupting your student. Your student's trying to say something and you're not letting them do it. You're not giving the student enough space. So space to hear, space to think, space to process language, space to hear the sounds of the language reverberating the mind's ear, space to make meaning, space to think of answers to questions that you've just asked, and space, of course, to speak. Space. Repetition. Don't just say it once or twice, say it 4 times or 5 times. The more opportunities a student gets to hear a piece of language, the more likely it is that it's going to stick, or at least give them a better foundation for it. We can also use repetition to decrease the density of our teacher talk, and also, once again, being kind to our students. This is something I use a lot when I'm giving instruction. So let me give you an example here. Imagine I'm teaching a group of students, they're just over here, and I say to them, okay, now I want you to draw a picture. I want you to draw a picture. No, put your pencils down, put your pens down, just listen. I want you to draw a picture of a goldfish. A goldfish. I want you to draw a picture of a goldfish. Now, the goldfish is in its bowl, its fish bowl. And the bowl is on a table. And David, put your pen down. Just, David, cross your arms like this. Yeah, just listen, no drawing yet. So I want you to draw a picture of a goldfish. The goldfish is in its bowl. The bowl is on a table. The table is in a room, in your house, and it can be any room at all, as long as it has a window. Because goldfish don't like to be in the dark. Okay? So one more time, just listen. I want you to draw a picture of a goldfish. The fish is in its bowl, the bowl is on a table, the table is in a room in your house, and it can be any room at all, as long as it has a window. In other words, the room must have a window, because it's cruel to keep goldfish in the dark. Are you ready? Okay, draw your pictures. Now, this repetition allows me to decrease the density of the talk, the text, the instructions here. And again, we're being kind to students. It's easier to comprehend. But also, it allows me to draw attention to language features in my own voice that I want students to remember, to take away with them. For example, as long as. It can be any room at all, as long as it has a window. The teacher's voice is the primary, most fundamental source of language input. And that can happen, or that can be the case at any time, even when we're giving instructions. By the way, this is an activity called Super Goldfish that I really love. After that, once students have drawn their pictures, they have to give their goldfish a name. And it can be any name at all, as long as it's not William Shakespeare, because that's the name of my goldfish. After that, you have to tell them that this goldfish, their goldfish, is an incredible goldfish. There's something it can do that no other goldfish in the world can do. It has a superpower. You have to decide what that thing is, and finally there's a homework, a writing activity, a story titled "The Day I Discovered My Goldfish's Superpower." That was repetition. Back chaining. Whatever happened to back chaining? I don't hear anybody talk about it anymore. It was there when I did my teacher training course all those years ago. I just demonstrated what could be referred to as forward chaining when I was talking about the instructions. We start at the beginning and we repeat, and each time we do so, we add on a little bit extra so that the instructions or the utterance grows in length. So I want you to draw a picture. I want you to draw a picture of a goldfish. I want you to draw a picture of a goldfish in its bowl, etc. Back chaining is the opposite. You'd start at the end of the utterance and move back to the beginning. So it could sound like muscle, muscle. Muscle. Not muscle, silent C. Muscle. A muscle. A muscle. It's almost a schwa. A muscle. A muscle. The muscle. The muscle. The muscle. Pull the muscle. Pull the muscle. I pulled a muscle. This is a really good technique for drawing attention to the minutiae of the phrase in this case. You know, the individual syllables, the weight of each one, the stress patterns, the specific sounds. And it's traditionally regarded as a drilling technique, one in which students would repeat after you, but it does not have to be. That's the case with modelling in general, you know. It's really nice when you're modelling and students naturally want to repeat after you without you actually, you know, telling them to do so. I'm sure this is something you've witnessed. It's a very standard way to interact if you're a student. And that, to me, is a lovely thing to try and aim for as a teaching. So that's back chaining. Nobody seems to talk about these days. I say bring back chaining. What we're dealing with here in this pull the muscle thing is a situation when a teacher could be taking advantage of a story, a personal story. And if I was going to walk into a classroom limping, I would probably preempt the question from a student asking me what's wrong and take a bit of time maybe to elaborate, think about that story. How am I going to tell it? Now, this is really important because when one talks about teachers exploiting, using, telling their own stories in the classroom, often there's a tendency to assume we're talking about long, drawn out, monologues from the teacher delivered to a room full of silent students who are maybe bored, and that's not what we're considering here. We're talking about a very short text. We're talking about a situation or a story which is very unremarkable, but at the same time meaningful. Meaningful, and a student actually expressed a curiosity, a motivation to know what the problem with the teacher was. Elaborate. It doesn't have to be too long or complicated. It could be as short as, well, on Saturday, I was running for a bus when I pulled a muscle. I was running for the bus when I pulled a muscle. How about that? I was running for the bus when I pulled a muscle, which provides us with a great opportunity for that standard, classic, grammatical example of aspect when simple meets continuous. You know, the classic example is, I was having a bath when the phone rang, which we've all taught. I have anyway, which is weird because nobody has baths these days, and we don't get disrupted because of technology by ringing phones. I think a much better way to update that example is, I was having a pee when I dropped my phone down the toilet. That's a much better way to update it. But even better is a personal example, as is the case here. I was running for the bus when I pulled a muscle. Yeah, I was running for the bus when I pulled a muscle. Paraphrasing, finding alternative words to express an idea. Very important for teachers. But the reason I mention it is because there's a 3-word phrase, a marker that we can use that will alert your students the fact that a paraphrase is coming. I probably overuse this as a teacher. The 3 words are, in other words. In fact, I used this already during the fishbowl thing. I said it can be any room at all. You can put your goldfish in any room at all as long as it has a window. In other words, it must have a window. In other words, alerting your students the fact that paraphrase is coming. We can also use it to elicit as an elicitation device. So imagine I'm telling a story. This is a story I've called Left on the Shelf, about this mysterious character. He's in a relationship with another mysterious character, and he popped the question. He popped the question. In other words, exactly. He asked her to marry him, and then they tied the knot. They tied the knot. In other words, exactly, they got married. So, in other words, is one example of many, many markers, many phrases that teachers can have in their repertoire. In other words. Grading your language, absolutely fundamental for all teachers to be aware of the language that they're using in the classroom. Now, I wasn't quite honest in the way that I described that story about the teacher who pulled a muscle, because in fact, the thing that got my attention when it happened is that when she walked over to her student and the student said, "What happened?" She said, "I pulled a muscle." And he said, "What?" And she said, like a twinge. And a twinge is a very low frequency word. It means a short, sudden pain. And in fact, that's the thing that got my attention 2 years ago or so when it happened. And what you've got there is a situation where the teacher is paraphrasing, but she's paraphrasing a phrase, "I pulled a muscle," which is probably about a B1 or B2 level phrase. She's paraphrasing it with one word which is beyond C2 level, which is not what paraphrasing is about. And we're going to excuse her because, as we mentioned before, she was a newly qualified teacher who maybe lacks the awareness. But we have to all develop an awareness of the language that we're using in the classroom. We want to avoid high frequency, maybe cultural words. We also want to try and avoid idiomaticity when we can. For example, if I'm teaching a group of A2 students, we're talking about what we did at the weekend. A student asks me, "What did I do at the weekend?" And I say, well, I was dragged along to a party. I was dragged along to a party. That's an idiomatic way to say, well, I was tired and I didn't want to go out, but My girlfriend wanted to go to a party, and so I had to go with her. You know, the second way would be a much better way to express that. I was dragged along to a party is a passive. There's no mention of my girlfriend. The agent remains a mystery. It's also an image, the image of me being dragged, which is, of course, a metaphor. It's a figurative use. It's a complex phrase. So as teachers, we have to build up our awareness of this and know how to grade our language according to the level of our learners. Language grading. I'd be very surprised if you know what this last one is, weaving, because it's a term that my friend and colleague, teacher trainer Nicola Meldrum uses. I think she coined it. Nicola's been to APAC before, so maybe you know her. The idea is that if a language item comes up in class, the teacher can then be clever and look for creative ways to weave it in and out of the lesson, you know, maybe through the questions that she asks, instructions she gives, small talk she makes. For example, at the end of the class, you could say to your student, well, thanks very much. You worked hard today. That was great. See you next week. And be careful. Make sure you don't pull a muscle. This is something we all do, but it's lovely, I think, really to acknowledge it. You could call this a language callback. A callback is a term that comes from the world of stand-up comedy. A comedian will make a joke and later in the set refer back to that joke. The audience will make a connection and the comedian's intention is to get a laugh. In our case, we want students to retain that piece of language, although a laugh can happen as well. So what we've just done is we've looked at 8 different teacher talk techniques. This is them right here, and I don't want you to think that this list is comprehensive. It is not. I've been making a note of teacher talk techniques like this for the last few years. I think I've got about 80, and I refer to these in the courses that I do. These are all, of course, in an attempt to turn our voices into pedagogical instruments, maximize the possibility of using teacher talk as a source of language input. That, to me, is a big part of what it's all about. One final thing to say about that exchange that I witnessed 2 years ago. I mentioned that I didn't want to be critical of that teacher because she was a newly qualified teacher. But also, if you think about it, she was doing exactly what she was expected to do according to so many teacher training courses. What did she do? Well, she kept her teacher talk down to a minimum. The student said, what happened? She said, I pulled a muscle, doesn't matter. What did you do at the weekend? She did everything she could to try and get her student to talk, to maximize student talking time. So although I can't be critical of her, we can be critical, I think, of our profession and how we see teacher talk and how it is so often represented as being the bad guy. So here we are, part 3 of the talk. To celebrate, I've put on a young man's t-shirt. This is a younger man's t-shirt as worn by an older gentleman. Last year, I turned 50 years old, which was never part of the plan. And this is a gift from my 2 longest running students here in Barcelona, Rosé and Miquel. So I thought I'd put on this t-shirt. A good opportunity, you know. Just before we finish off, 2 things to say. Number 1, a huge thank you to APAC for inviting me to give this talk. It's a big honour. It's a pleasure. I always like being involved with APAC. And of course, a big thank you to you for making it this far. I've still got the image of you as per that photograph that I showed you at the start. But you've been moving a bit. You've not been like that. The second thing, if you'd like to find out more about me and my work, go to lessonstream.com. I have a newsletter which goes out once a week usually, and I share news and ideas about using story and storytelling in the classroom. I also do a lot of lives on YouTube. So feel free to subscribe to my channel or sign up to the newsletter and I'll let you know there. It's all free. So Just to recap, teacher talk, I believe it's given a very bad press as a terrible, terrible image. We should not stigmatize it. We should recognize the importance of it, embrace it, develop it. Having said that, the teacher talking time rule is a very good one as a guiding principle, especially for newly qualified teachers or teachers in training, but it's only a guiding principle. It should only be a rule of thumb. It's not a mantra. So just before we go, I'd like to share 3 suggestions and one last very short story. Okay? Suggestion number 1, let's call it what it is, and that is teacher talk. I say this because too often in professional discussions, I hear teachers refer to it as teacher talking time, which is strange because it's not just about time, it's not just about quantity, it's about teacher talk quality, teacher talk volume, teacher talk speed, teacher talk pace, teacher talk clarity, enunciation, teacher talk density, teacher talk interactivity, teacher talk comprehensibility. It's about language grading, asking questions, responding to answers. It's about so much more than just time. So when we're talking about it, I think it's very useful to refer to it as just teacher talk. 2 words, not 3. So that was my first suggestion. And my second suggestion is for other teacher trainers like me. It's true, we've said that newly qualified teachers or trainees teachers have a tendency to talk too much. But that can be a symptom of a wider issue, which is a lack of awareness. So give out the teacher talking time rule, the rule of thumb, but make sure you do so with an accompanying postscript. And the postscript could sound something like this. An essential skill for any teacher is to be able to speak less and use your voice sparingly. But that does not mean that teacher talk is bad. When you leave this training course, you will have years to work on the effectiveness of your teacher talk and develop your classroom communicative skills. So that's an example of a postscript that we can give out along with the teacher talking time rule of thumb. And my last suggestion, a very personal experience of mine, that I've found that the one thing that has allowed me to develop as a teacher, develop as a classroom communicator, and develop my teacher's voice more than anything is to embrace storytelling. Storytelling in the classroom. And a lot of teachers feel uncomfortable about that. They think, well, wait a minute, isn't that a bit teacher-centered? But that's an assumption that there's this long monologue delivered to a room full of silent students, maybe bored. That's not the case. When I think of a story from the teacher, I think of a very short story, maybe something unremarkable and yet meaningful. The idea is not to posture, not to show off to your students. That's why unremarkable yet meaningful can be particularly valuable. Prepare your stories, reflect on them. And at the end of the day, a story is just a text. It's an embodied text, but human beings are inherently fascinated by other human beings. And your students, whether you realize this or not, are fascinated by you. They want to know who you are. They're curious. Take advantage of that. A teacher's story is just an embodied text. There should be nothing whatsoever controversial about using them in the classroom. I said there'd be one last very short story. A good friend of mine has just taken up making sculptures as a hobby. Sculpture making. He's really fascinated. He's really, really passionate about it, chiseling away at that marble. Unfortunately, he's really, really bad at it. Oh, some of the sculptures he's making are awful, absolutely awful. In fact, his art teacher has told him very specifically that he should keep his sculpture making time down to a minimum. Silly thought. It's not a true story, obviously. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Hope to see you at the workshop. Thanks again to APAC. Thank you to you. Develop your teacher talk. Bye-bye.